On this episode of the Up In Podcast.
So eugenics is the belief that society can essentially be controlled and improved if we try to control sort of who reproduces. And really what that means is sort of encouraging certain types of people to have children while discouraging or preventing others from doing so. And those others are, of course, always people with disabilities and sort of other marginalized communities. And so this era, so the eugenics movement, I think, grew out of the late 19th century, early 20th century, and it was, we saw sort of forced sterilization as well as bans on marriage and institutionalization as sort of mechanisms to prevent people with disabilities from reproducing, as well as those who were deemed sort of socially unfit.
Families separated through Child Protective Services voiced their anger on the steps of the state capitol today.
They say the system has a history of racial discrimination.
The CPS system is just a part of a bigger system. We have to destroy the whole damn thing.
53% of Black children will be investigated by the child welfare system by the time they turn 18.
The family policing system forcibly separates over 200,000 children from their families every year. Can a system that began with racist intent ever become a system that makes all children and communities safe?
We know the answer is no. Absolutely not.
Welcome to the Up In Podcast, a podcast that looks toward the abolition of the child welfare system, which we at Up In more accurately call the family policing system.
In this podcast, we contemplate the history of family separations in the U.S., the current state of the family policing system, and what a future without family policing can look like.
We're your hosts. I'm Josie Pickens.
And I'm Jason Oliver. Let's get started.
Welcome back to the Up In Podcast, where we imagine a world beyond family policing. This episode is a companion to our Reclaiming Safety essay series, where we explore what real protection looks like when we move away from surveillance and punishment and toward community care. In this conversation, we sit down with Dr. Robyn Powell, a leading voice on disability rights and justice, to talk about how ableism and the legacy of eugenics are embedded in today's family policing system, why disabled parents face higher risk of separation, and how we can build a future where disabled families are supported through care, access, and community instead of surveillance and control.
Dr. Robyn Powell is an assistant professor of law at Stetson University College of Law and a senior research associate at the Lurie Institute for Disability Policy at Brandeis University. Her scholarship centers on disability law, reproductive justice, family regulation, and constitutional law, with a particular focus on the rights of disabled parents and the abolition of the family policing system. She is the principal author of the National Council on Disabilities landmark report, Rocking the Cradle, Ensuring the Rights of Parents with Disabilities and Their Children, and her work, published in leading law reviews and interdisciplinary journals, critically examines how law and policy perpetuate ableism and eugenics. Welcome, Robyn, and thank you for joining us.
We appreciate you so much for being here. And as Jason read off all of these amazing things that you've done, all of this work that you continue to do for disabled families, we want to start with a little bit of your story, if that's okay. Can you tell us how you came to this work and when you began to recognize that what we called child welfare actually functions as family policing?
Absolutely. Thanks for asking. I think I came into this work a little accidentally. So I have a background as a social worker. That was my first sort of career. And so I always sort of came into this thinking through the lens of social work. I obviously then became an attorney. And I guess I would also add, I'm a person with a disability. So as a disabled woman, sort of all of these areas sort of intertwined personally and professionally. And so I came to this work, I think, both as a disabled scholar and as someone who's really spent over a decade studying disability policy, especially with respect to the rights, needs, and experiences of disabled parents and their children. And over time, I kept hearing really the same devastating story over and over again. A disabled parent, especially a disabled parent who is poor or multiply marginalized or who was just lacking access to services, was losing their children not because of abuse or neglect, but because of stereotypes and really, I think, systems that were designed to surveil them rather than help them. And so I've done a lot of research, including qualitative work with attorneys and parents and policy advocates. And that has increasingly, I think, made clear to me that what we call the child welfare system functions far more like a policing system. And so a few years ago, I was working on a paper where I was really trying to, solve the issues. I was, trying to come up with sort of what are the solutions to addressing this issue that I've been so passionate about for so long. And as I was writing this paper, I remember one day just sitting with my research assistant and saying, I don't think we can fix the system. And I think he looked at me like I had lost my marbles a little bit. And I said, I don't think the system's broken. I think the system's doing what it's supposed to do. And that's the problem. And so in that moment, I really recognized sort of how the system uses really coercive investigations and monitoring and removal practices that really do, I think, mirror the criminal legal surveillance systems that we have seen. And families are being policed, not supported under the guise of sort of, protecting children. And so learning all of this and having sort of this moment of clarity, I think fundamentally shaped how I thought about all of this. And so it really has shaped sort of my scholarship and my commitment to sort of imagining something better. And that profound moment changed the paper from what we should do to fix the system to really saying we need to blow up the system. And so that is the moment I think that I became sort of all in on abolition.
I want to drill down on something that you spoke about a moment ago, in that, even with topics like abuse and neglect, which are kind of contentious in themselves, right? But even outside of that, this wasn't even the reasoning that people were using to remove children from the families of disabled parents, right? And the history of eugenics still shapes how society views who is fit, quote unquote, fit to parent, who we see as who is fit to parent. What do we mean by the term eugenics, and how does the myth that disabled people shouldn't have children continue to influence both policy and public opinion?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So I really believe that eugenics is sort of how we understand our current problems. And I don't claim to be a historian by any respect, but I think that not understanding these ideas through a lens of eugenics is really a big mistake. So eugenics is the belief that society can essentially be controlled and improved if we try to control sort of who reproduces. And really what that means is sort of encouraging certain types of people to have children while discouraging or preventing others from doing so. And those others are, of course, always people with disabilities and sort of other marginalized communities. And so this era, sort of the eugenics movement, I think grew out of the late 19th century, early 20th century. And it was, we saw sort of forced sterilization as well as bans on marriage and institutionalization as sort of mechanisms to prevent people with disabilities from reproducing, as well as those who were deemed sort of socially unfit. And this was approved by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1927 in the Buck v. Bell decision, a case that has never been overturned, might I add. But that case came about after a woman who was considered, quote unquote, feeble-minded, which was the term they used at the time, had had a child. And after having that child, they said, we will not release you from this institution unless you are sterilized. And the whole rationale that we see in the Supreme Court is that it's better for society and for the child if they're not being raised by a person with a disability. And so that was in 1927 that the Buck v. Bell decision was decided. And I think many people imagine eugenics as something from the past. But its core, I think, ideas really continue to live on today. Disabled people, we continue to face skepticism about our ability to parent, and really that leads to sort of continuing forced sterilization, restrictions imposed by guardians, and even, I would say, biased medical counseling. And again, it's all based on this idea that people with disabilities are not fit to have children. And courts still to this day cite disability as sort of a predictor of harm, despite clear evidence that disability alone does not correlate with parental unfitness. And we see, over 40 states continue to include disability as grounds for termination of parental rights. And so what we're seeing time and time again is that the legacy of eugenics, I think, really continues to show up when professionals and policymakers assume that people with disabilities are inherently incapable of raising children. As well as sort of when services are denied instead of provided, again, based on that assumption that they won't benefit, and when the state intervenes not to support families, but to instead limit people with disabilities' autonomy and right to raise a child.
I want to just highlight a couple of things that people may not immediately understand what that means in the audience, right, and among listeners. So we're talking about forced sterilization or biased medical counseling. Like, what does that actually look like in terms in practice or in policy? Like, what does that look like for people?
So it means essentially stopping people with disabilities from being able to prevent, essentially tying their tubes. And it is often done sort of coercively. We have over 31 states and the District of Columbia that still allow for forced sterilization of people with disabilities. Generally speaking, it does need to go through the courts, but the courts are really sort of just rubber stamping this. If a guardian or a caregiver says, it's in the person's best interest for them not to be able to reproduce, the courts essentially always sort of defer to that guardian or caregiver. And if you want sort of a current example of what this looks like, we can think of Britney Spears from a few years ago when she was being released from her 13-year conservatorship, which is just another word for guardianship. And part of her 3-minute testimony on why she should no longer be under a conservatorship was that she mentioned she wanted to have more children, but she was being denied that opportunity because the doctors would not remove her IUD because her guardian or conservator would not allow it. So that, I think, is just sort of emblematic of what this all looks like. And with respect to sort of medical counseling, I mean, even myself as a person with a disability, I can't tell you the number of times doctors have asked me over the years, would you like to have a hysterectomy? And that has never been for medical justifications. There's never been like me indicating that that's something I wanted. But doctors continue to sort of have those eugenics-based beliefs that people with disabilities should not be reproducing. So I think, there's so many examples of this happening today. It's just frightening.
That's so much information. I'm thinking of myself as someone who has tried to have conversations with doctors about, hysterectomies and it being a kind of a denial process and being pushed against for me, and having that be at the forefront for birthing people or, living with disabilities. So that.
Yeah, I was just going to say that's something I hear too. A lot of women talking about when they speak with doctors and broach the topic of having a hysterectomy, the doctor tries to discourage them and says, like, what if your future husband, I think is usually going to, the expectation is like, what if your future husband wants to have kids, right? And so it's they make it really challenging for people who want to have hysterectomies to do it. So like, oh no, this isn't something that we can come back. So to hear the kind of opposite perspective of this being something that's encouraged for you, even with no kind of medical basis, when people who actually have real medical challenges are actively being discouraged from it is really interesting.
Yeah, people with disabilities are never asked if they're going to have children. So, growing up, all of my friends, would always get asked, like, when are you going to have kids? You're getting older. When are you going to have kids? And I can tell you that people with disabilities do not get that question. And so there is sort of the pendulum has swung so far from one to the other. Like, we don't even get any sort of discouragement to get a hysterectomy. We're encouraged. There is a presumption that we should not be having children. And that, again, it is alive and well today. It's just something that continues. And I think, we can take that even further with contraception. I always say contraception is this weird thing for people with disabilities because there's sort of two sides of it. On the one side is many people with disabilities are forced to use contraception. And you can, again, Britney Spears being a really good example. And then research also shows sort of this other group of people with disabilities that are not even offered contraception because there's a presumption that they don't need it. And what I think is sort of the through line between both of those is just the lack of autonomy, that lack of people with disabilities being able to make those decisions. And again, I think it all ties back to eugenics.
Yeah, that's so invites a much deeper conversation around the intersections and connections of reproductive justice work and disability justice work in the same way that we try to draw parallels between reproductive justice work and family policing abolition. So thank you for making all of that clear. Robyn, I'd like to talk a bit about neglect, which Jason said earlier was, this contentious term that really is a catch-all for really anything. Many so-called neglect cases are really about poverty. Things like the lack of childcare, housing, or medical care. How do poverty and disability combine to make families more vulnerable? And what kinds of support would actually help those families stay together?
That is an excellent question. So first, to sort of answer one piece of it, then I'll get into the support piece. But I think it's important to understand sort of this idea of neglect. And I fully 100% agree that the definitions of neglect really just mean sort of poverty. There's really no other definition. And I always say, poverty is just, the lack of something, which is easily, you can correct that, right? By just providing that something. But I would also just importantly note that with people with disabilities or disabled parents in particular, we see that courts and family policing systems in general use often this idea of predictive neglect. So there doesn't even need to be anything at all. Predictive neglect has been used against parents with disabilities, which is why parents with disabilities have a very high chance of having involvement within the first year of them giving birth. And it's often under this idea of predictive neglect. They must have this crystal ball somewhere that has determined sort of that people with disabilities will just put their children in harm. So I think it's important to understand that. Again, I fully agree that the definition of neglect is really just sort of interchangeable with the definition of poverty. And that is so important because poverty is both a cause and consequence of disability, meaning that people with disabilities are more likely to live in poverty, and poverty often can cause disabilities. So the connections between poverty and disability is significant. And we know that most cases that come into the family policing system are rooted in poverty, not abuse, and families who lack stable housing or adequate income or childcare, or even I would say medical or mental health care, are far more likely to be investigated and separated, right? And so for families where there's disabled parents, I think these barriers are then compounded by sort of this lack of accessible services, gaps in sort of benefits programs, and these sort of just overarching, I'd say, institutional biases that exist. So what do we do about that? Real support, I think, means things like universal access to housing, and childcare and healthcare. It also means things like home and community-based services for disabled parents and their children. And it means income supports that actually meet basic needs. And it really, I think, sort of means shifting resources away from surveillance and instead toward meeting material conditions. Because when families have what they need, they stay safely together. And so we can do this if we want to.
this podcast, we don't meeting material conditions and needs of people. We don't agree with that at all. That's definitely not something that we talk about here at Upend. I'm just like laughing and hearing, we just, childcare, like housing, these are basic things. And yet it's such a challenge to make this a priority.
Which is wild. That is just it's completely bananas. Like, we could easily shift our priorities if we wanted to.
We hope you're enjoying the Upend podcast. A quick note, Upend is funded through the generosity of people like you who believe that ending the harm of the family policing system will help us create a safer future. If you're enjoying this podcast, we hope that you'll consider donating to our work. Visit upandmovement.org/donate for more information.
I want to talk about parents with mental health disabilities. How do you see the family policing system treating those parents with mental health disabilities, and what kinds of support could make parenting more sustainable rather than leading to removal?
Yeah, so parents with mental health disabilities, I think, encounter sort of the worst of the worst discrimination by the family policing system. And that's because they are routinely treated as if their sort of disability tells the whole story about their parenting. That their disability, their diagnosis is sort of indicative of what kind of parents they will be. And so instead of individualized assessments, parents who have mental health disabilities face sort of these blanket assumptions that they're unstable, they're unpredictable, and most notably, I think, dangerous. And these myths are deeply rooted in stigma. Indeed, tons of research shows that people with mental health disabilities are far more likely to be the victims of violence than the perpetrators. But when we hear stories about parents with mental health disabilities, it's always the worst case scenarios, right? We hear, terrible stories about parents who have postpartum syndrome and things like that doing terrible things, but we don't. And so people assume that that's what happens with all parents who have mental health disabilities, which of course is not the case. And again, most parents with mental health disabilities are fully capable of raising their children. And so again, it's all deeply, I think, rooted in stigma. And so what actually can help these families is to first recognize their capacity to be parents. I think that's sort of where I would start, but also ensuring that they have access to sort of voluntary, non-coercive mental health care, that they have access to sort of stable housing, respite, peer support, and parenting assistance that supports their autonomy, meaning we ask them what they need. We don't make any presumptions about what they need. When supports, I think, are designed collaboratively rather than imposed upon through sort of court mandates, parents are able to safely and confidently care for their children, and they can benefit from all of those supports. But again, I think there's these assumptions that parents with mental health disabilities can't do it, that they're dangerous, and that they won't benefit from services, or that we impose all of these ridiculous services on them that don't actually address any of their needs, and just require them to jump through a million hoops. And sort of that is the sort of common experience of parents with mental health disabilities.
And thank you for that, Robyn. I am, thinking also about physical disabilities, and I'm sure that some of the answers that you just offered around, families who are dealing with mental health disabilities would apply to physical disabilities as well. We're talking shame, we're talking stigma, we're talking stereotypes, we're talking biases. We know that this is often the center of how we understand people living with physical disabilities, and particularly parents living with physical disabilities. What patterns or assumptions do you see most in family policing cases, and what kind of support actually help parents with physical disabilities thrive?
Yeah, so you're absolutely correct. Many of sort of the things I mentioned about parents with mental health disabilities, I think would also relate to parents who have physical disabilities. But, sort of parents with physical disabilities, they often sort of confront assumptions that they cannot meet their children's sort of physical needs, that they're too quote unquote dependent, or that their children are going to be their caregivers. So there's this idea that if you need help to care for yourself, that means you can't care for others. I think parents with physical disabilities often have this sort of myth that they experience where if they receive care, then they can't give care. So if they need any physical care, then that must mean that they can't be caregivers, right? Because they are care recipients. And sort of this assumption that you can't be both. And I think these misconceptions overlook the role of sort of adaptive equipment, accessible environments, family and sort of community networks, and sort of creative parenting strategies. I think parents with disabilities are undoubtedly sort of the most creative. And they've lived this life where we're forced to live in a world that's not built for us. So we are very creative people. So true support, I think, would include things like assistive technologies, accessible homes and home modifications, accessible transportation, and personal assistance services that really give disabled parents sort of that right to care for their children, to love their children, to nurture their children. And I think when supports are available, the question is no longer whether disabled people can parent, but rather whether systems are willing to let them.
I'm wondering about, you talked about the creativity of the disabled community. And as I speak to people, I have some friends who have helped to really teach me about ableism and the, crip wisdom and just the types of knowledge that can come from being more aware of the different ways that we move through the world. I'm wondering what technologies or resources you see people who might not consider themselves disabled at the moment, right? What types of things we can learn or take advantage of if we are particularly parents that we might learn from disabled parents or something. Are there things that come to mind that we could all benefit from if we really paid attention to disabled families?
I mean, I think looking at sort of the strategies that parents with disabilities use, whether it is adapting their home environment, right, so that they can access everything they need. I mean, I think something I think about a lot is parents who use wheelchairs often don't use changing tables because they can't get their wheelchair underneath it, so they use a table or desk, sort of things like that. I think parents with disabilities in general, and I think parents without disabilities also have benefited a lot from sort of the increase in technology, right? Like Instacart, getting groceries delivered. That is a really sort of an accommodation. I would say it makes sort of things like just groceries accessible. And I think everyone can benefit from that. It's also just sort of how you care for your children. I think parents with disabilities or physical disabilities in particular really have to work with the child, and they create, I think, this mutual relationship where they work off each other. And there's studies that talk about sort of have looked at and observed parents with physical disabilities changing newborn babies, and newborn babies even know I can't move around and things like that, and they see how kids adapt to their parents' needs. And I think that is just something that we don't recognize, that kids are able to adapt, and kids of disabled parents benefit tremendously. I don't think we talk about sort of what are the benefits of having a parent with a disability, but there are things like resilience. There are things like understanding the importance of inclusion. Kids of disabled parents, I think, are far more open-minded. I think that they are independent in a way that is not a bad thing. I think that often kids are not taught to be independent. And you will see that none of those things are that they are caring for their parents, which is often this assumption. And I will tell you that I think my observations is that parents with disabilities are so cautious about having their kids do anything that they probably honestly do less chores because they don't want to ever be seen as sort of relying on their child for anything that a quote unquote parent should be doing. So again, I think that these environments are actually a benefit to a lot of kids. And we just focus so much on like, oh, what is the child losing and not what is the child gaining?
I'm thinking about some of the binaries that people create as they're thinking about families where, all right, if the care has to go one way, right? So if it's a disabled parent, then the child must be taking care of the parent, and the parent's not able to like offer care to the child. And so much of our work in terms of like as abolitionists is tearing down those binaries, right? It doesn't all have to look one way. We can create the infrastructure that we need to thrive, and that can look different for all of us. And that doesn't have to be a burden. Like that can actually be something that we are excited about creating. So if we're imagining an abolitionist future for parents with disabilities in particular, what would real support look like as we're kind of looking toward the future? How could community care through things like pods or mutual aid or peer networks replace the surveillance and punishment that families face today? I know we've kind of jumped in on this a bit, but I just really think that there is a lot of potential for us as we're thinking about accommodations, because that language is so kind of targeted toward the disabled community, to think about that more broadly for like what does an accommodationist future look like, right, from an abolitionist perspective? Yeah, what does that look like?
Yeah, that's a great question. I will start by just noting that accessibility benefits everyone. So if you don't believe me, think about curb cuts, right? Push a stroller and you're going to appreciate curb cuts. So everyone benefits when things are accessible. So I feel like we often think of accessibility as sort of an afterthought or a burden, but it's actually something that everyone benefits from. So what then does sort of like an abolitionist future look like? And I think that it rejects the idea that families need to be monitored and controlled in order to be safe. And I think instead it really sort of imagines a world where communities rather than systems are providing that care. And I think that means sort of accessible community-run childcare. It means things like guaranteed housing, income and disability benefits that actually allow families to thrive. Also, things like peer-led parenting support. Parents with disabilities learn from other parents with disabilities. And so how do we sort of facilitate that and support that? Things like networks of mutual aid that can respond to crises without resulting in criminalization. And really, I think sort of it means investing in the conditions that make caregiving possible rather than punishing families when those sort of conditions fail. And so for parents with disabilities, it also means really fully implementing disability justice principles, things like interdependence, collective access, liberation, and really the belief that all families deserve to exist and be supported without living in constant fear of removal.
You mentioned income benefits, and I think that is also something that people don't have a clear idea about in terms of wages and income. I think folks hear like terms like disability check and have an association in their mind of folks just kind of chilling and living comfortably. But you specifically mentioned like income benefits that allow people to thrive. Like, what does that look like now? And why do you feel like people aren't able to thrive now?
Yeah, there is this belief that disabled people are living this fabulous life. And I'd love to know all these rich disabled people because that's not true. So if you receive supplemental security income or SSI, which is the most common Social Security disability benefit, you receive about $950 a month. And that does not increase if you have children. So you don't receive extra benefits if you have children, which means you are expected to be able to live on about $950 a month, no matter if you're one person or a family. And that is just impossible. And if you get married to a person that receives benefits also, your benefits are cut in half. If you get married to a person who does not receive benefits, you will lose your benefits entirely. And I think all of these systems have been built on the presumption that people with disabilities will not form families. Going back to eugenics, there's none of our disability policies or benefits programs exist in a way that recognizes that people with disabilities want to have relationships and they want to have families. And so we have all of these support programs that don't actually support families or does not support parenting in any way or relationship formation. And so that is something we could address. Again, we know that it costs so much more to put children into the foster care system than if we just were to support them in their families. And I think that people don't recognize just how little disability benefits are. There's this presumption that people with disabilities are getting rich off of these benefits, and I can assure you that no one is getting rich off of them because they are not even tenable at all.
This is so rich. I'm learning so much from you, Robyn, and I'm even thinking about your answer of what are the benefits? How do children benefit when, they have a parent who is disabled? I'm also thinking as an organizer, how I can learn and benefit from other, from disabled organizers and leaders. I'm thinking about how we can strengthen our interdependence. These are things that we need when we're talking about community care overall. I'm also thinking about the amount of mapping and thought that goes into the lives of people living with disabilities, right? You mentioned earlier this idea of pods being a part of the community care component of how we can support families. Can you talk a bit about pod mapping?
I think, this is sort of one of those examples where we need to be led by parents with disabilities. And so I'm not going to sort of offer all the solutions because I think we do need to sort of be looking to disabled parents to sort of determine what best benefits them. But we know that mutual aid networks is sort of a huge piece of disability justice, and it hasn't been super used in the world of parenting to this point, but I think it could be incredibly beneficial. We've seen sort of mutual aid networks help with things like, emergencies and sort of responses. I'm thinking about the wildfires in California, for example, and disabled people really created sort of these really important mutual aid networks to sort of support one another. It means though, parents with disabilities helping one another because everyone has sort of different needs and experiences. And it really, I think, requires sort of that collaboration and also sort of support for that. Because right now, so many disability-led organizations are not fully disability-led, first of all. They are loosely disability-led and are not based on these ideas of disability justice and interdependence. There's such this huge priority for people with disabilities to be quote unquote independent, that we've sort of totally dismissed the importance of interdependence. So I think these pods or mutual aid networks could really embrace that idea that everyone needs help. Everyone needs others, and that's not a bad thing. So how do we create communities that can really thrive, help one another? And how do we really respect those communities? And again, I think it goes back to sort of bringing disabled people to the forefront of these conversations, having them lead the way. I'm always hesitant to sort of determine what other disabled people need because I can't speak for all disabled people. But there is sort of, and I when I say bring them to the table, it also can't be tokenizing. They have to not only be brought to the table, but they need to be at the head of the table, right? And so how do we bring this together? And I think that is what makes disability justice so important. And disability justice really grew out of, amongst other things, abolition in general. And so disability justice principles are very much aligned with the abolition movement. And so I think there's just so much opportunity for collaboration.
You mentioned how a lot of times, organizations that are supposed to be rooted in disability justice are often loosely led or not led at all by disabled people. Where do you see promising examples of disabled leadership in the family policing, abolition space, or any spaces? We'd love some examples.
Yeah, so there's been a lot of work done on abolition within the criminal legal system amongst disability justice organizers, I would say, and scholars. There hasn't been as much focus on family policing, but again, I think they're incredibly aligned, right? And as I said, there has been a lot of work on sort of mutual aid networks in general, whether it is helping someone in an emergency or helping someone who's at risk of losing or has lost sort of community-based supports, because our systems are terrible in many ways. And so I think people with disabilities have really sort of tried to essentially pick up the slack in many ways. But I think that isn't necessarily a terrible thing if we can support that. And again, I think family policing is so interconnected with the disability justice principles in general, which again are based on the same ideas, interdependence, collective access, liberation, intersectionality, all of these things that I think are so vital to sort of the family policing abolition movement in general. And so I think there's just so much opportunities that are just going ignored. And I think that, the piece around disability led. So disability justice came out in the early 2000s in response to the disability rights movement, which was, often leaving people behind that had disabilities. And so the disability rights movement has been based on, in many parts, disability led, but as you pointed out, sort of that has not been sort of at the center of it, really. That has not come to reality, but disability justice is actually disability led, which is why I completely believe that we need to sort of shift the paradigm and really adopt the principles of disability justice. And, I write about in sort of my first piece on abolition, just like how aligned the two movements are and how I think they can be beneficial to both parties. And again, I go back to sort of what I started with, like disabled people are so creative and they're so used to living in a world that's not made for them that they can come up with programs and policies and support systems in ways that I don't think the average person will be able to, but yet everyone would benefit, right? If we sort of focus on the needs of those that are most marginalized, everyone will benefit, right? Like that is sort of, I think, at the center of it. Like if we were to intentionally focus on those whose needs or those who have been most marginalized or oppressed, everyone would benefit. But instead, we sort of don't do that. And I think that's where things fall apart.
If people are coming out of this podcast wanting to really follow up and start to dive into disability justice, if this is their introduction, where would you direct them?
I would go to SIN's Invalid. So it is a grassroots disability justice arts movement that really were the creators of the disability justice principles. And they are sort of at the forefront of this. There's also a lot of writing that's been done by folks like Alice Wong, who recently passed away, but who was a huge leader in the disability justice movement. And she created the Disability Visibility Project. And so you can also go to her website, which I'm certain still exists. And she did such incredible work on disability justice that you would learn immensely. There's many books written by her. I think it's just sort of looking at sort of SIN's Invalid and Alice Wong's work, specifically Disability Visibility Project, would be great areas to just sort of begin your looking and understanding of disability justice.
Wow, you've just given us so much, Robyn. This has been so informative and so meaningful. Before we close, Can you also share how people can connect with you and follow your work?
Yeah, so I am at Stetson Law. And so there is a website with me. And so you can, if you go to the Stetson Law website, you can find me. I'm happy to answer questions and communicate. I'm always looking to sort of connect. So you can look me up on social media, of course, or you can just send me an email, rpowell3@law.stetson.edu. And again, I'm always looking to collaborate, and I truly believe that disability and disability justice in particular need to be part of the abolition movement moving forward. And so anything I can do to sort of support that is really important to me.
Amazing. Thank you for joining us, Robyn, and for sharing so much with us. I definitely learned a lot from this conversation.
Yes, we appreciate you taking time with us and appreciate all the work that you're doing on behalf of people living with disabilities and, families.
And those of us who aren't living with, with disabilities, right?
Absolutely.
To benefit from this as well. Mm-hmm.
Not at the moment.
Right, exactly.
Right. Anyone can acquire a disability at any moment. And, we are a club that is open to all, I always say. And if you are lucky enough to live long enough, you will most likely have a disability. Also, 1 in 4 individuals in the United States have a disability. So it is a very large segment of our population.
Absolutely. And that's something that I was going to say as well. There are some people who are living with disabilities who don't recognize that or who don't understand that. So, yeah, this work is for all of us and for everyone. So we really appreciate you being here.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for the Up In podcast as we explore family policing system abolition. To learn more about Up In and our work to strengthen families and communities, visit our website at upinmovement.org and follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Up In Movement.